Good morning, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Fress, and I'll be your host for the next hour. You're listening to FirstAmendmentRadio.net. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. And now we'll continue our reading and discussion of this great Protestant work entitled The History of Romanism by John Dowling. And yesterday we concluded with subsection 46 on page 167, if you're following along. And this is the period of time when Charles Martel, Charles the Hammer, and his great French army became the protectorate of the Roman Catholic Church and of the papacy and of Rome and of all of the West. As a matter of fact, the Pope was going to make Charles Martel essentially the emperor of the West. It was a dirty deal cooked up between the Pope and Charles Martel in treasonous behavior against the legitimate ruling power at the time, the emperor in the East in Constantinople. And so now Charles Martel has died. And the Lombards, which Charles Martel kept at bay, is now plotting to assail Rome and also the Exarch of Ravenna and make himself the king of the West. And so the Pope is in a desperate situation. And so he makes a trip to see the king of the Lombards. Luitprand is his name. And he makes a deal to the Lombard king that if he would return, not only not attack Rome and Italy, but that if he would return to the Pope, the four cities that he had previously conquered, then the Pope would open the gates of heaven for the king of the Lombards. But if he would not give back those four cities which he had conquered, then the Pope would guarantee him eternal hell in the flames of purgatory, right? So the Pope makes his pretended wielding of the golden key, that is the spiritual key of the self-styled Bishop of Bishops, and who has made the world to believe that he can shut up heaven or open heaven at his whim for whoever will help him. And the Lombard king is being duped, as the whole world has been duped by the papacy. All right? So the Pope has given him a threat. You either return those four cities, or I'll lock up heaven, and you can't get in. And if you don't return those four cities which you conquered, I'll open the gates of hell for you. All right? Now, just because the Lombard king, Luitprand, is one of the ignorant and superstitious people of this great period of time, he gives back those four cities. But he doesn't give them to the emperor to whom they rightly belong, the emperor in Constantinople. He gives them to the Pope. Now the Pope becomes, for the first time in history, a king. And this is one step, the first necessary step, to making that which claims to be the Lord of Lords at this time, the Bishop of Bishops, the universal bishop, that is the Pope. For the first time in history, he now becomes a king. And if his ultimate aim is to become King of Kings and Lord of Lords, this is a necessary first step. All right, now we're talking about a period shortly after King Charles the Hammer's death. He says a few years later, A.D. 751, this is the beginning of subsection 47 on page 167 if you're following along. He says a few years later, A.D. 751, Pepin, the son of Charles Martel, conceived the design of dethroning the feeble monarch Childeric III. Okay, he's the legitimate king of France, Childeric III. and under whom his father, Charles Martel, Charles the Hammer, served, but Charles the Hammer had the same position. His literal title was just simply mayor of the court, and Pepin, his son, wants both the power of the king, but also the title as well. His father, Charles Martel, didn't have the title king. He was a vassal of Childeric III, although Childeric III had given him all the power of the kingdom. And so Charles Martel was king by agreement. But Childeric III was the official king of the Kingdom of France. So when Charles Martel died, his son steps up in his father's place, wielding the power of Childeric III, but not the title of king. So he wants to be known as the king. So this presents to him a moral dilemma. Do I have the right to do this? Is this right to do this? I won't make the decision myself. I'll give it to the universal bishop, wherein righteousness dwelleth, right? If he's the vicar of Christ, certainly his decision will be final and it will be righteous, right? So here's the thinking of Pepin, the son of Charles the Hammer. He says, a few years later, A.D. 751, Pepin, the son of Martel, conceived the design of dethroning the feebled monarch Childeric III, under whom he was acting as prime minister and viceroy. Okay? He says, though he possessed the power of the sovereign, he possessed all the power of the king, yet he was still a subject and determined, if possible, to obtain the title of king as well as his authority. Now, not deeming it prudent to depose a legitimate sovereign without providing to satisfy the scruples of the timid and the superstitious, Pepin resolved to submit the case of conscience to Pope Zachary, viz., who best deserves to be called king? He who was possessed of the title without the power, that is, Childeric in this case, or he who possessed the power without the title, Pepin. Okay? So the Pope is given this moral dilemma to decide who should be king of France. This sets a precedent. Pay very close attention. The Pope is being given the power to determine who the king of France should be. Should it be the reigning Childeric III, who has transferred his power to Pepin, who merely has a title, or who does not have the title king? Or should the Pope decide that whoever has the power should also have the title? That is, Pepin. Should Pepin be king of France? Now, here's the answer. The situation of Zachary, exposed as he was, on the one hand, to the indignation of the emperor, and on the other to the attacks of the warlike Lombards, was such as to leave no doubt that he would give such an answer as would secure the favor and protection of the powerful Pepin. So here you have, the papacy wants to overthrow the emperor in the East and no longer have any more ties or any more subjection to the emperor in the East. The Pope wants to be emperor of the West, and he could flatter Pepin by assigning him the moral decision that he should overthrow Childeric and have both the power and the title of king, and thereby, if the Pope could make Pepin the king, then he could gain, with that flattery, Pepin's support against the Lombards, who were once again threatening the papacy, the Roman Catholic Church, the city of Rome, and Ravenna, and all of Italy, essentially. So we have a lot of dynamics working here. But it all ends in two things. The Pope picking the King of France, crowning him, essentially, a new precedent in the world, and then we have the overthrow of the authority of the Eastern Empire under the Emperor in Constantinople, and we have the Pope becoming a temporal king himself. And if you count that it is the Pope who is literally placing the crown upon Pepin's head, you have the Pope not only becoming a king, but a king of kings. For whoever has the power to crown a king and to make him king is his superior. Is that not correct? That's the way the papacy sees it. All right, again, he says the situation of Pope Zachary, exposed as he was on the one hand to the indignation of the emperor. Remember, the papacy was treasonous. They were trying to overthrow the legitimate emperor in Constantinople. And on the other hand, to the attacks of the warlike Lombards, was such as to leave no doubt that he would give such an answer as would secure the favor and protection of the powerful Pepin. Accordingly, he gave without hesitation such an answer as the usurper, that is Pepin, desired, viz., that he, that is Pepin, ought to be called king who possessed the power, rather than he who, without the regal power, possessed only the title. So here it is. The Pope has made his decision. He who has the power in France should also be called with the title king. Pepin has the power, but not the title. So the papacy, by this decision, has literally made Pepin the king. He has overthrown Childeric, the legitimate king of France. This is regime change. This is what we see in the world today. This is regime change. The Pope literally, by the word of his mouth, taking the crown off Childeric III and putting it upon the head of this usurper, Pepin. And now he's known as King Pepin. And it says, the feeble Childeric was immediately deposed and confined to a monastery. I want you to notice this. We're going to come back to it. Childeric was immediately deposed and confined to a monastery, and Pepin became king in his stead. All by the word of the Pope. And not only was Childeric the subject of regime change, he was imprisoned in a monastery. It's supposed to be a holy place, isn't it? But you'll find all throughout history, the monasteries of the Roman Catholic Church have been the underground railroad. They've been used for other purposes than to hold up monks in their solitude to pray and to think for the Pope. They're literally prisons, okay? And we've spoken voluminously over the last decade here on First Amendment Radio about the atrocities that have taken place in the monasteries of the Roman Catholic Church. It's the Roman Catholic Church's underground railroad, but it's not underground at all. It's right on top of terra firma. You can drive right by them, and they've been used for every diabolical purpose that you can imagine. And one of those being the whisking away of the assassin of President Abraham Lincoln. He was transferred from monastery to monastery to monastery until he finally wound up at the Vatican under the Pope's protective guard before he was finally captured and brought back to this country. The monasteries have always been used by the Roman Catholic Church for political intrigue. And as this case also, Childeric was overthrown, and Pepin became king, and Childeric was sequestered under guard, you might imagine, in this monastery, and Pepin was proclaimed King of France in his stead. He was crowned and anointed by Boniface, the Pope's legate, and 2 years after, in order to render his title as sacred as possible so that no one could doubt, no one could challenge Pepin for his crown, the ceremony was performed again by Pope Stephen, the successor of Zachary, on the occasion of a journey into France to obtain his succor or his support against the Lombards. So for the meantime, when the situation was hot, the Pope stayed home and sent his legate to literally crown Pepin. But in order to make sure that there was no challenge, no one said that this wasn't legitimate, the Pope made a trip on the occasion of trying to entice Pepin to be his protector. When the situation got hot with the Lombards, the Pope flattered Pepin by recrowning him again in person. Okay? Flattery. Wonderful thing, isn't it? And it said, upon the arrival of Pope Stephen into Pepin's dominions on this occasion, he was received with the most extravagant honors. The king and queen, that is Pepin and his wife, with their 2 sons, Charles and Carloman, the chief lords of the court, and most of the French nobility went out 3 miles to meet him. Okay? So this great big entourage walked 3 miles out into the country to meet the Pope. And it says, upon his approach, Pepin dismounted from his horse and fell prostrate on the ground. Men are not supposed to worship men, but Pepin sees the Pope as God in the flesh. So Pepin dismounts from his horse and falls prostrate on the ground, and not suffering the Pope to dismount from his horse, he attended him part of the way on foot, performing, according to the Romish historian Anastasius, quote, the office of his groom and equerry, unquote. In other words, King Pepin, after groveling on the ground at the foot of the Pope and his horse, got up and grabbed the Pope's horse by the bridle and walked him into town, like he was the Pope's stablemate. Here's the King of France subjecting himself to the status of a stable master for the Pope. He's literally showing the world that he is the servant of the papacy. And well, he should serve the papacy, because were it not for the papacy, he would not be wearing the crown of France. There would never have been regime change in France. And Pepin is a vassal of the Pope. And the Pope is the king of the King of France. And the King of France is visibly making that evident. Lots of precedent set on this occasion. Precedent that is still maintained today, in our day. The Pope is the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. That's how he sees himself, and that's how the kings of the earth see the Pope. And they answer to the Pope. Now, if you don't think you have sovereignty in this country, and your vote doesn't count, and the people have no say in government, this is why. The Pope picks the kings of the earth. Now, we've gone through this before, but I'll briefly answer many questions. People will be raising their hands and saying, well, how does the Pope pick the President of the United States? The Pope picks the President of the United States because the papacy picks the candidate for both political offices. Whether they be a candidate for President of the Democratic Party or a candidate for President of the Republican Party, they are papal picks. They are picked by a surrogate organization known as the Council on Foreign Relations and other great think tanks for the Vatican in this country. That's how we get our candidates for president. The papacy approves 2 different candidates, so long as there's only 2 political parties in this country. So you get to go to the polls and pick for whatever papal candidate you wish. And the Pope doesn't really care which, because they're both going to serve the papacy. Otherwise, they'd never be made candidates for the office. That's how the Pope picks the President of the United States. Now, subsection 48. In the year 753, Astolphus, the king of the Lombards, invaded the Exarchate and laid siege to the city of Ravenna. The city was bravely defended by Eutychius, the last of the exarchs, till his affairs were desperate when he embarked on a vessel with the remnant of his soldiers and fled to his master, the emperor in Constantinople. So now, the representative of Constantinople is gone. That leaves a power vacuum, doesn't it? Ravenna was the location for the exarch of Constantinople. He was the representative of the legitimate sovereign over the West. And now he has abandoned his station there in Ravenna and gone back to Constantinople. So now it's just Childeric, or rather the Lombard king versus the Pope, and to see if Pepin can stand up and defend the papacy. He says, thus ended the Exarchate of Ravenna, and with it the splendor of that ancient city in which for nearly 2 centuries the exarchs, as the viceroys of the emperors, had maintained the imperial power in the West. Okay? So now we have the West literally being abandoned by Constantinople. And he said, elevated by this conquest, Astolphus dispatched a messenger to Rome, demanding the submission of the inhabitants, asserting that as the exarch was his by right of conquest, so also were all the cities and other places that had heretofore been subject to the exarchs of Italy, that is, all Italian dominions of the emperor. Okay? So this is a great threat to the papacy. And it says, at the same time he threatened to march with his army to Rome and to put all the inhabitants to the sword unless they acknowledged his government and paid him a yearly tribute of a piece of gold each for each person. Now, subsection 49. In these perilous circumstances, Stephen, that is Pope Stephen, ventured to inform the emperor in the east, right, in Constantinople, who was still nominally the sovereign of Rome, and to solicit his support. The Pope's in trouble. And now, after committing treason against the emperor in the east, now he is desperate that the emperors in the east come to his rescue. And it says the Emperor Constantine, however, was too busy in pursuing his victories over the Saracens in the east to do more than send an ambassador to make the best terms he could with Astolphus. The ambassador John bore with him commands to the Pope to unite his persuasions with his own, to induce the Lombard king to send a minister to Constantinople to treat of an accommodation, and in the meantime to forbear hostilities. So here the emperor wants the Pope to get on board with him and have the Lombard king send a representative to Constantinople to work out some kind of an armistice, some kind of an agreement. And it says this Astolphus absolutely refused, and John was soon dispatched to his master in Constantinople to inform him that nothing but a powerful army sent immediately into Italy could save the remnant of the ancient Roman Empire in that country. So, we've come to a turning point, and we'll finish our discussion as we return from the break. You're listening to Inquisition Update on First Amendment Radio.
Hear it first on FirstAmendmentRadio.com. and FirstAmendmentRadio.net. The program you are listening to is 100% sponsored by you, the listener, on this First Amendment Rights Media channel. You will notice that there are few commercials on this radio network. There's a good reason for that. Corporate advertising dollars come with strings that limit program content. So without your help, these programs cannot continue on Internet or our several affiliates. If you benefit by the educational law programs, we ask you to give. If you are admonished or nurtured by the Bible and ministry programs, we ask you to give. If some voice a cause that you are passionate about, we ask you to give. If you believe in any of these, we ask you to support them as you would a missionary on a continual basis, as if giving a tithe for missionary radio. These programs are not commercially viable and must be supported by those faithful to the cause of truth. Look for the button to sponsor your favorite programs at our listen and schedule pages on the Internet. Then, when you subscribe, we will send you the last quarterly MP3 CD of that program immediately, and continue to do so with each new quarter. We will also give you unlimited archive access to all of our programs. We're asking you to give much less than a tithe, so that you may also send support directly to a particular program host, cause, and anywhere else the Spirit may lead you. Do all to the glory of our God and Creator, for His holy nation, the only kingdom that will last forever. Thank you for listening. Since the beginning of time, kings have sought it, nations have fought for it. It has been traded, it has been borrowed, it has been purchased, it has been stolen. There's a reason for it. To secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our posterity, invest with the security of gold and silver. Call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188 or visit DiscountGoldandSilverTrading.net. Listen to Financial Survival with your host, Melody Cedarstrom, right here on FirstAmendmentRadio.com at 4 p.m. Eastern or 1 p.m. Pacific Time. Visit DiscountGoldandSilverTrading.net or call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188. Toll free, 1-800-375-4188.
Welcome back from the break. You're listening to the second half hour of Inquisition Update on First Amendment Radio. And if you'd like to support this program and keep it on the air, please support First Amendment Radio, who sponsors it. Now, the Emperor in the East has sent word to Astolphus, come on over to Constantinople, we'll work out something. And the king of the Lombards says, nothing doing. There's nothing going to save the West. There's nothing going to happen except I'm going to conquer the West and rule it by conquest, by the law of conquest. The only thing that's going to stop me is if you send a wholesale army to defend your territory. Okay? So the representative of Constantinople is sent back with word to Constantinople that the Lombards are going to conquer unless we send an army to defend. Okay? And it says, as another expedient, 2 abbots were sent to the camp of the conqueror to plead with him the cause of St. Peter. Okay? So the Pope sends 2 abbots, holy men, representing the Pope, to the camp of the Lombards and pleads the case of the successor of St. Peter, the apostle, wielding that golden sword again, right? And the king admitted them to his presence, but only to reproach them for meddling in worldly affairs. I can just hear the king of the Lombards say, you're holy men. You're supposed to be on your knees praying and reading books and that sort of thing. What are you doing meddling in the affairs of kings? Go back to your monastery and do what you monks do, and I'm going to conquer the West. stay out of my business. You have no authority. Neither does the Pope. All right? So the king of the Lombards isn't going to concede to the pretended kingship of the Pope. All right? The king admitted them into his presence, these monks, but only to reproach them for meddling in worldly affairs, and commanded them to return immediately to their monasteries. Failing in this, the Pope tried processions, okay, those holy parades. You know what a procession is? Have you ever seen a Roman Catholic procession? It's a Roman Catholic religious parade where out in front normally is the monstrance with the Eucharist, the wafer God in it, that's supposed to be the blood, body, soul, and divinity of Jesus to be crucified and sacrificed over and over and over again on the Roman Catholic altars at the Mass. And then behind that, all the cardinals, the bishops, and finally they bring the Pope up in the rear, seated upon his litter, where they carry him high above the crowd. And everybody curtsies and waves and crosses themselves and genuflects and worships him as the replacement of the Son of God on earth. And it's supposed to be a very, very solemn event, as though Christ himself were being carried down the streets. And also images and paintings and sculptures of dead saints are carried in this parade. And all of these saints are being prayed to by the peoples lined up and down the streets on their knees, praying to this patron saint or that patron saint for the protection of the Pope. So it's a big public display of just how much influence, idolatrous influence, that the Pope has over the crowds, over the masses. Okay? So he tries one of these processions. And one in this particular procession was solemnly carried the images of the Virgin Mary, that is, statue of the Virgin Mary, a statue of St. Peter and St. Paul, and a host of other saints. But these saints, too, or their images, appeared deaf to their entreaties, and their condition was daily becoming more critical. In other words, even this holy procession of the Pope had no influence on the Lombard king. Okay? So the Lombard king says, you're not only not a king, you're not even a holy man. He has no respect whatsoever for the kingly status of the Pope, nor his claim to divine status. Here, this heathen king has the wisdom that every Christian should have, that the Pope is neither a king nor a lord. And he pays no mind to any of these pretenses of the Pope. So now the situation for the Pope is becoming critical. Let me ask my listeners a question. At this time, if you were a Bible-believing Christian, and you had studied the Scriptures of Daniel, and you had studied the Scriptures of John, and you had studied the Scriptures and the prophecies of all these great prophets of God, and you knew in your heart of hearts, by the written Word of God and the testimony of history, that the papacy is, was, and always will be the Antichrist, what would you think when you were watching all these things taking place? The Pope pretending to have spiritual power, to lock up the kingdom of heaven, or to let loose the power to appoint kings and overthrow governments, the power to become a king himself, the power to become Lord of Lords and King of Kings. What would you think of all this? Wouldn't you console yourself and thank God that He revealed to you through the Scriptures that this is the workings of Antichrist? That this one who calls himself blasphemously as the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, who should be beseeching God for help, seeks the solace and protection of men. First, an emperor who he has committed treason against, and then a king that he has crowned with his own hands. Wouldn't he, instead of depending upon them for support against the Lombard kings, be beseeching the kingdom of heaven and its Lord for help? He cannot, because he's not a subject of the King of heaven. He's not a son of God. He's a son of Satan. So he has to rely upon men. They would console themselves, Bible-believing Christians at this time, seeing all of these intrigues, these all-powerful signs and lying wonders, these lies and hypocrisy, seeing the hypocrisy of the papacy, would simply console himself, trusting that he fully understood the scriptures that were written to identify positively who the Antichrist is. And just as assuredly as they had their assurance in Jesus Christ, they had equal assurance that the papacy was the Antichrist. It was the man of sin. It was the son of perdition, and they were watching his workings at the present time. That's how God's people maintained throughout the century their steadfast belief that the papacy is, was, and always will be the Antichrist of Scripture, history, and prophecy. They saw his workings in the world, and they were convinced. To deny that the papacy was the Antichrist would be a laughable thing, would be a shameful thing in the body of Christ. To bring doubt about something about which God left no doubt, to deny that the Pope was the Antichrist at that time would have been just as shameful as denying that Jesus was the Christ. In God's house, in God's kingdom, there was no doubt. These events of history were read about, talked about, were the talk of the entire empire. And God's people knew the truth. Okay? They came to the same conclusion that we should come to today. And that's why we're reading this book. Aren't you just as assured now that the papacy is the Antichrist described in the Scriptures as I am? If not, we've got over 500 pages yet to read in this book. And by the time it's over, you will not be able to deny that the papacy is the Antichrist any more than you'll be able to deny that Jesus is the Christ. All right, subsection 50, page 169, if you're following along, he said, in this extremity, this serious, dire situation that Pope Stephen is in, Pope Stephen resolved to apply in person for the succor to Pepin, King of France, whom we have already seen encouraged by the Pope in usurping the throne of his master, Childeric. Okay? This is another dirty deal. Now, if the papacy were the representative of the voice of Jesus Christ on the earth, as he claims by his very title, Vicar of Christ, would he resort to such hypocrisy? Stephen, upon his arrival in France, was received with the highest honor and entertained as the visible successor of the apostle. After a short delay, he recrossed the Alps at the head of a victorious army, which was led by the king in person. Pepin, the king that the Pope made, right? He says the ambitious Pope, while an honored guest at the court of Pepin, anxious to see himself elevated to the rank of an earthly monarch, had been cunning enough to obtain from him a promise that if he would restore the places that might be captured from Astolphus, that they would not be returned to the emperor in Constantinople, but they would be freely possessed by St. Peter and his successors, the popes. Okay, here's another dirty deal. The Pope is proposing to King Pepin that if he gets back the territories that the Lombards have conquered, that he would not give them back to the emperor to whom they rightly belong, but that he would give them to the popes, and thereby making the popes a king. Now, if precedent sets precedent. Wouldn't you think that if Pepin conquered the Lombards and restored all the territories that they had conquered, and instead of giving them to the emperor in the east and giving them to the Pope, wouldn't Pepin be making the Pope the emperor? And then Pepin being his master? Pepin then would be the king of a king? We're going to see some more hypocrisy here. It said, after a feeble resistance to the arms of Pepin, the Lombards were compelled to submit. Their king was besieged in his metropolis Pavia, and as the price of peace was compelled to sign a treaty to deliver up to the Pope the exarchate in Ravenna, quote, with all the cities, castles, and territories thereto belonging, to be forever held in and possessed by the most holy Pope Stephen and his successors in the apostolic see of St. Peter, unquote. Those are the terms of the armistice. Pepin has conquered the Lombards. The Lombards have given up all their possessions that they took by force. And instead of Pepin giving it back to the empire, the emperor in Constantinople, to whom it rightly belongs, it's given to the Pope. So the Pope is now officially a king. Made a king, once again, by man. Just as the Pope was made universal bishop by a man, the Emperor Phocas. God hasn't given the Pope anything at this point. Has he? Everything that the Pope claims to possess by the authority of heaven, he did not get from heaven. He got from men. And by conniving and lying and threatening the keys of heaven or the gates of hell, all of it pretense. All of his power, all of his dominions, is all gotten by man, is all gotten from man. None of it from God. And don't you know, God's people at this time were very much aware of where the papacy got its power and seat and great authority. It was not from God. It's a marvelous revelation, isn't it? See how valuable history can be? And this is why they've held books from this, like this, from us, to deceive us. But history tells the tale. The Bible prophesies the rise of the man of sin. The Apostle Paul, the prophet Paul, prophesied the rise of this man of sin, this son of perdition, this wicked. And he rose just exactly the way Paul prophesied it. After there must soon come a great falling away, and then that man of sin will be revealed. When the restrainer is taken out of the way, there will be a great apostasy, and that man of sin will be revealed. Every Bible-believing Christian was confident that if God prophesied something, history would record its fulfillment, its unique and complete fulfillment. And that's what this book does. It's the historical record of the fulfillment of Paul's prophecy about the rise of the man of sin. And all of God's house were convinced. You couldn't shake them from the belief that the papacy was the Antichrist. They'd seen his rise with their own eyes. Subsection 51. No sooner had Pepin returned to France than Astolphus, who had signed this treaty, resolved not to fill it. Do you suppose Astolphus finally realized his folly? The Pope has no power. No power at all. Except the power given him by the ignorant and idolatrous and superstitious people. He got his power from men, not from God. He can't lock up heaven against me. He can't open the gates of perdition again for me. He has no authority at all. He might have also recognized that had he actually surrendered this territory, it should rightfully go back to the emperor in Constantinople, not the Pope. He's just a holy man, just like his monks. He should go back to his monastery and do what monks do, and not try to be a king. What wisdom this heathen has. He says, no sooner had Pepin returned to France than Astolphus, who had signed this treaty, resolved not to fulfill it. In other words, I'm not going to give back the land that I conquered. He said the Pope had frequently reminded the Lombard king of the dishonesty and the injustice of keeping those territories which belonged of right to the emperor. Okay. Astolphus is mindful that the Pope heaped all kinds of guilt upon Astolphus for not giving those lands to the emperor. And here now the papacy has goaded him, deceived him into giving those lands not back to the emperor, but to the Pope himself. So Astolphus understands the greed and the duplicity and the treason and every wicked thing about the papacy. No wonder he's not going to keep his agreement. He says, and it was very natural for him to conclude that if he had no right to keep that which belonged to another, if Astolphus had no right to keep that which belonged to another, neither had King Pepin any right to bestow it, or Pope Stephen to receive it. And that of the three, he himself, Astolphus, king of the Lombards, had as much right to it as any one of them. Astolphus accordingly laid siege to Rome, burned with rage against the Pope, first for bringing the French to invade his dominions, and second for claiming the exarchate for himself, after having so frequently threatened him with the vengeance of heaven for his injustice in not restoring that territory to his, quote, most religious son, the emperor, unquote, who alone had a right to it. He therefore declared to the people that he came not as an enemy to them, but an enemy to the Pope, and that if they would deliver him up, they should be treated with the greatest kindness. But if they refused to deliver up the Pope, that he would level the walls of the city with the ground and leave none of them alive to tell the tale. You see God's hand in all this? I do. It's a perfect demonstration of the true origin of the papacy. That if it were indeed the vicar of Christ, the voice of God on the earth, it would not fall victim to this heathen king. But in this case, since the Pope is not the voice of God on the earth, nor his vicar, nor anything having to do with heaven, God has brought forth this heathen king to put it to the test, so that the whole world can see, so that none of us would be deceived. Subsection 52, the Pope immediately wrote a letter, an urgent letter, and sent it by an abbot named Fulrad to his former protector, King Pepin, in which he says, quote, to defend the church is of all works the most meritorious. Okay? Here the Pope is talking about merit, not grace. If you want to earn your way to heaven, you have to merit heaven. And the most meritorious work that you, King Pepin, can do is to defend the Roman Catholic Church. You'll be saved by your works. I will open the keys of heaven if you will mount an army to come to my defense against the Lombards. To defend the church, said the Pope, is of all works the most meritorious, and that to which is reserved the greatest reward in the world to come. God might might himself have defended his church or raised up others to ascertain and defend the just rights of his apostle St. Peter. But it pleased God to choose you, my most excellent son, out of the whole human race for that holy purpose. You see the flattery? It's the same flattery that Satan used in the Garden of Eden against Adam and Eve. You shall not surely die, but you shall be as gods, knowing both good and evil. So the Pope's using the same tactic, flattery. God could have chosen himself to come down and defend the Roman Catholic Church, but instead, God has chosen you, my excellent son, King Pepin, out of the whole human race for that holy purpose. You think Pepin will be as wise as the king of the Lombards? He says, for it was in compliance with his divine inspiration and command that I applied to you, that I came into your kingdom, that I exhorted you to espouse the cause of his beloved apostle and your great protector, St. Peter. More flattery. The Pope is going to put a hook in the jaw of King Pepin and drag him in to protect the Pope and the Roman Catholic Church against the King of the Lombards. More flatteries, he says, you espoused his cause accordingly, and your zeal for his honor was quickly rewarded with a single and miraculous victory. But my most excellent son, St. Peter has not yet reaped the last advantage from so glorious a victory, though owing entirely to him. The perfidious and wicked Astolphus has not yet yielded to him 1 foot of ground. Nay, unmindful of his oath, and actuated by the devil, he has begun hostilities anew, and bidding defiance both to you and to St. Peter, threatens us and the whole Roman people with death and destruction, as the abbot Fulrad and his companions will inform you. Unquote. So first flattery, and then commitment. You must come to the rescue of the Pope. If you wish heaven to be open to you and hell to be shut, you must come to defend the Pope against the Lombards. And you'll find that tomorrow on the program that Pepin didn't have the brains of the King of the Lombards. Such is Christianity today.
Visit crosstheborder.org, C-R-O-S-S, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of Nicholas Arthur's new book titled When the Third Temple is Built. That's crosstheborder.org. When it comes to prophecy today, much of the evangelical Christian world has their eyes on Israel, waiting and watching to see when the third temple will begin to be built. The plans are drawn, the Jewish people are eager. Most evangelical Christians today believe that the rapture will happen before the third temple is built. Hi, I'm Michael Eugene. I was taught that Daniel's 70th week was in the future. Is that really what the Bible teaches? Have we searched the scriptures and found this to be true? Why is it so important for a re-established Israel to build a third temple in Jerusalem? Is it necessary to build a temple on the same location already occupied by the Dome of the Rock? Is it necessary for sacrifices to take place in the temple on Temple Mount? Is there really a rapture followed by 7 years of tribulation? What is the New Testament temple? Can we identify history and prophecy? Who is the first beast in Revelation chapter 13? Who are the 7 kings in Revelation 17? I have asked all these questions, and I have found Nicholas Arthur's new book, When the Third Temple is Built, answers all these questions and more using Scripture to interpret Scripture. The Bible says that no prophecy of Scripture is of any private interpretation. Nicholas shows us in his new book, When the Third Temple is Built, how the Bible interprets prophecy and not man's private interpretation. Visit crosstheborder.org, C-R-O-S-S, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of Nicholas Arthur's new book titled When the Third Temple is Built. That's crosstheborder.org.